Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So now let's look at the motor system in the spinal cord, how the motor system is wired together. And it's a two neuron pathway. One is the upper motor neuron and one is the lower motor neuron. And these two neurons together, they fire synchronously in order to contract the skeletal muscle voluntarily. Now, this is very important. Now, this is the mechanism of a voluntary skeletal muscle contraction. How does it happen? It's a two neuron pathway. One is the upper motor neuron and one is the lower motor neuron. And first the upper motor neuron fires and then it takes the message to the lower. This is the upper motor neuron somewhere in the cerebral cortex, as shown here, and it sends its axons down to the lower motor neuron. And here is the upper motor neuron axon is synapsing with the cell body of the lower motor neuron located somewhere in the spinal cord, and then in the ventral horn, and then the axon of the lower motor neuron is going to reach out to the skeletal muscle and make it contract. Now this diagram is showing a highly schematic chart of the entire nervous system, and the dotted line, it divides the entire nervous system into right and left halves. So in summary, the upper motor neuron will fire first. This is located somewhere in the cerebral cortex. It's actually in the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex, which is the precentral gyrus. There is a central sulcus in the frontal lobe, and the gyrus that is in front of this central circus. It contains the primary motor areas, and these axons are coming, and the cell bodies of these neurons, the upper motor neurons, are residing there in that gyrus, and their axons, they course downwards from the cerebral cortex, and they come down to the spinal cord and reach the lower motor neurons in the ventral horn of the spinal cord gray matter, and from there the axons of the lower motor neurons are going to innervate the skeletal muscle. Now, if either the upper or the lower motor neurons, either of them are lesioned or they are damaged in some way, the person will not be able to generate a voluntary contraction of the skeletal muscle. That is the basic idea. Now let's look at the details of shown inside this figure as regards to the location of the upper and the lower motor neurons. First, we focus on the lower motor neuron, and you can see where the cell body of the lower motor neuron is located. It is present in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. This is the left side of the body. This is the left side of the body. And let's say we want to innervate a skeletal muscle on the left side of the body, whether it be a quadriceps muscle or a brachialis muscle or a biceps muscle on the left side. So the cell body of its lower motor neuron will be located on the same side, or the ipsilateral side. If you want to innervate, for example, left bicep muscle, the cell body of the lower motor neuron will be located on the same side, that is the left side of the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and at the level of the muscle being innervated. It is segmentally located. For example, the spinal cord segments which are supplying, for example, the upper limb, they are from C5 to T1 segments, and they form the brachial plexus. So all the muscles of the upper limb, their cell bodies will be coming from the left side of the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and from segments C5 to T1, and they are segmentally located, and they will innervate the upper limb muscles on the same side. So the lower motor neurons are present ipsilateral to the same side of the muscle being innervated, and they are segmentally located at the level of the muscle being innervated. In contrast, when we look at the upper motor neurons, where are the cell bodies of the upper motor neurons located? Over here you can see the cell bodies of the upper motor neuron that are going to innervate, for example, the biceps muscle on the left side. Their cell bodies are contained on the contralateral or the opposite side. Their cell bodies are present in the motor area of the right frontal lobe. The motor area that is present over there, the primary motor area in the precentral gyrus. The cell bodies of the upper motor neurons that are going to home in onto the lower motor neurons that are going to innervate the left biceps, will be located on the contralateral side, that is the right primary motor cortex. This is the cell body of the upper motor neuron located at the right side. So it's on the contralateral side. The axons, they cross over to the left side at some point in the CNS, and that is known as the pyramidal decussation. It is at the border between the spinal cord and the medullary junction, where the medulla becomes the spinal cord. At that very junction, these fibers, they cross over from the right side to the left side. So the cell bodies of the upper motor neurons are located contralateral, and they are present in the cerebral cortex. They are not at the level of the muscles that they're going to innervate. Now, the reason why this is important, it's because the clinical significance of it is that if you have a weakness of skeletal muscle, and you have a problem in contracting the skeletal muscles voluntarily that are present on the left side of the body, it could mean that either the lower motor neurons are damaged or the upper motor neurons are damaged, which are present on the right side of the body. It means that the right motor cortex will be damaged in order to affect the muscles of the left side of the body if the upper motor neurons are damaged. So if there is some arterial occlusion, or if there's some stroke, or if there's some infarction on the right side of the brain, it will affect the skeletal muscles of the left side of the body, and vice versa. If the skeletal muscles of the right side of the body are affected, then the lesion must be present, upper motor neuron lesion must be present on the left side of the body. That is the clinical significance. So in order to understand this, the clinical presentation, we need to know the neuroanatomy, how the upper and the lower motor neurons are wired together. So the upper motor neurons, they send their axons. These axons, they course down from the cortex up to the medulla in the corticospinal tract. Now this is known as the corticospinal tract, as the name indicates. This tract, a bundle of axons that is coming from the motor cortex. It's coming down from the cortical area, the primary motor area. It's coursing down through the cortex and into the medulla, and here they cross over, and this is known as the pyramidal decussation. Pyramidal is another name for corticospinal tract, and decussation means it is an oblique crossing over a distance. So, when the corticospinal tract reaches from the primary motor area of the cortex down to the medulla, it crosses obliquely over to the left side, and then it courses downwards through the entire length of the spinal cord, and gives off axons at each segment of the spinal cord, at all segmental levels. which go and synapse upon in the ventral horn, and they synapse upon an alpha motor neuron or a lower motor neuron, which is then going to exit through the ventral roots, and then it's going to innervate its respective segmental skeletal muscle. So the bottom line is that it's written over here that for voluntary contraction of the skeletal muscle, you need both the upper and the lower motor neurons to be functioning properly. First, the upper motor neuron fires. It is present contralateral to the side of the skeletal muscle. It innervates, and it's going to synapse on the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron is present on the same side, or the ipsilateral side, and it is segmentally located, and it's at the level of the skeletal muscle, and both of them fire, and together they're going to cause a voluntary skeletal muscle contraction. So this is the pathway, two-neuron pathway, when you have to contract the skeletal muscles voluntarily with your own will. But the skeletal muscles, they also contract involuntarily or through a stretch reflex. So how do you make the skeletal muscles contract involuntarily? And that pathway is shown over here. You need two neurons again. One is, but in contrast to the voluntary skeletal muscle contraction here, the two neurons are, one is a sensory neuron and one is a motor neuron. The sensory neuron is coming from the muscle stretch receptors, or also known as the muscle spindles, present inside the skeletal muscle. And these muscle stretch receptors, they are innervated by these neurons, or the cell bodies you can see over here. The peripheral process of the cell body is innervating the muscle spindle. When the muscle spindle is stimulated, it generates an action potential, and that action potential is carried down by this neuron. This is transferred to this neuron's peripheral process, and this neuron, its cell body is present in the dorsal root ganglion, and it's present in the dorsal root. This is the 1A fiber of the muscles coming from the muscle spindle. So it's going to relay the information in the dorsal root ganglion, and the central process is going to go inside the spinal cord, and it directly goes to the ventral horn, and it's going to synapse with the lower motor neuron innervating this muscle. For example, if we stretch the quadriceps muscle, then it's going to the sensory neuron is going to directly synapse on the lower motor neuron supplying the quadriceps muscle at the same level, the same segment, and it's going to make it contract. This is a reflex. There is no voluntary contraction, it's a reflex contraction. You stretch the muscle, it contracts reflexly. So again, it's a two neuron pathway. One is the sensory neuron, and it synapses on the alpha motor neuron, and it's going to cause involuntary contraction of the muscle. So this is known as the monosynaptic reflex, and this, if you tap on the tendon of any skeletal muscle, it's going to stretch that muscle, and the muscle spindle will be activated, it will be stimulated, it will carry the information to the spinal cord, and the lower motor neuron will fire and make it contract. Now these are the muscle stretch reflexes, also known as the tendon reflexes. Now the question is that, does the upper motor neurons have a role to play, or do they influence the muscle stretch reflexes? Because they do not directly innervate the muscles. The upper motor neurons do not directly innervate the skeletal muscles. They're controlling the lower motor neurons that are going to innervate the skeletal muscles. So do they have a role? the upper motor neurons, do they have a role in the muscle tendon reflexes? And the answer is yes, because it's over here. The upper motor neurons have a net inhibitory effect on the muscle stretch reflexes. They don't stop the muscle stretch reflexes altogether, or they do not begin them, but once the muscle stretch reflexes are stimulated, what the upper motor neurons do, they're going to have a net inhibitory effect on them. They're going to prevent more than one stretch reflex contraction per tendon tap. It's not going to happen that if you tap the tendon once and the muscle contracts many times. This will happen when you lesion the upper motor neurons. The upper motor neurons are controlling the muscle tendon reflexes in the sense that for every tap of the muscle tendon, you'll get one reflex contraction, not more than one. So that is the net inhibitory effect of the upper motor neurons on the muscle tendon reflexes. This fact is clinically significant because when you lesion the corticospinal tract or any of the upper motor neurons below the crossing or above the crossing, in both conditions, and the upper motor neurons are damaged, you're going to have muscle tendon stretch reflexes which are going to be hyperactive. It's going to be better than good because the inhibitory control is lost. The inhibition, so you're going to get multiple reflex muscle contractions per tendon tap. Tap the tendon once and the muscle is going to contract many times in an upper motor neuron lesion. Whether you lesion the tract below the crossing or above the crossing. And in contrast, when you look at, if you lesion the lower motor neuron, if you lesion the lower motor neuron, if you damage this lower motor neuron, what is going to happen to the tendon stretch stretch reflex? They're going to be suppressed, or they're going to be absent. There will be no reflexes because the information will be coming. When you tap the tendon, the information will be coming through the sensory neuron, but the lower motor neuron will be damaged, which is going to cause the muscle contraction. So both in upper and lower motor neurons, you will have a weakness of the voluntary contraction of the skeletal muscle, but how will you distinguish whether this is an upper motor neuron lesion or a lower motor neuron lesion? You will look at the reflexes. In the upper motor neuron lesions, the reflexes will be hyperactive, or they will be hyperreflexia. The reflexes will be more, but in contrast to when there is a lower motor neuron lesion, they will be absent muscle tendon stretch reflexes.